Hello, everybody. Welcome to this video. Recently, I was cut off from the other video where I think I was talking about, well, I don't remember what I was talking about, but I do know that I was getting into like more psychological matters and using myself as an example. Um, and I've also kind of thought that I want to use these videos right now, at least, as a way to kind of further develop, explore ideas, and basically just go into some stuff. So, what I was thinking about just now was the fact that, like, you have a lot of information, right? You have a lot of education, you have a lot of books, you have a lot of content, and you try to find ways to make that information and that knowledge practical, to actually apply it in real life, right? So it doesn't just stay as a theoretical framework, which is also good to develop um, further mental abilities and capacities. But also because, and this is very important, which I didn't mention in the other video, but I wrote about it, which is a thought I had, it's better than the alternative. The alternative initially is always the opposite. So we could say, what would be the opposite of using your prefrontal lobe, your executive functions, planning, thinking, using philosophy, asking the big questions, knowing how to ask questions, etc.? What would be the opposite of that? Well, we could say initially you don't use any of that, and things can be pretty things can go pretty well if you're never in situations where you need to be critical, if you're never under stress, if you never need to regulate yourself, if you never need to think through a problem. But we're all humans and we're eventually going to have to do that, even if we live under a rock. So because we have needs, like, what are you going to eat, what are you going to where are you going to sleep, how are you going to cover yourself from the temperature, from the cold, from the hot, how are you going to relieve yourself of your basic necessities, discharge, recharge, right? Discharge is like all of the physiological disgusting necessities, right? And recharge is like eating, things like that. So eventually you need to think things through. And if you don't have those abilities, those capacities developed, what you end up doing is you get emotional and you get reactive, right? And you're always reacting to things. Um, you're confused, you live in chaos, you never know what's going on, you constantly have problems, right? And then the we could say the objective, then one of the objectives of thinking things through, of developing further mental capacities and abilities, would be then to be able to anticipate problems, right? When in relation to problem solving. So the alternative is not having those abilities. And if we push the alternative further, we could say then that people that don't think things through basically become a sort of impulsive beast, right? Primitively speaking, you become, like I mentioned, very reactive, right? So then that would be the importance of further developing your ideas, at least in a practical sense, right? Now, returning to the initial idea, of wanting to find practical ways or applied areas where you can use the knowledge, the information you're learning, I feel like initially it's very hard, right? Because you have all this information and you're like, okay, now I know about behaviorism, I know about epistemology, I know about, I don't know, the unconscious, things like this. Okay, and so what, right? So in order for you need examples, right? When I feel like that's why examples work really well. I was just looking into um, an example of intermittent reinforcement, where the typical example is when you go to a casino and you may win, but you lose a bunch of times, but then you win once, and it's intermittent because it's not stable. It doesn't happen all the time. It's not, there's no prediction to it. It just randomly happens. And that's addictive because you get a dopaminergic like kick. And with that dopamine, you start to feel good while you're expecting to win, but you don't see that you're losing and you're becoming addicted to the thing. So the example there would be like casinos and betting. But then there was another example which I just read, which is when you're watching a soccer game, right? And the goal can come at any moment, right? A team can score at any moment. So you must watch the whole game because what happens if you go to the bathroom or if you're not watching and the goal happens, you're going to miss the goal, right? Live on TV. So those type of examples help. But then we can also talk about the examples when you're learning are different than the examples when when you look at your life, when you look out into your life. And like I mentioned, we have personal problems, individual problems, and we have collective problems, right? So I was thinking about how I thought about problem solving as I was problem solving, right? I recently had a problem. um there's like like they say, there's a stimulus, right? There's something you see, something you perceive, right? Something you hear, right? There's a stimulus, and that stimulus makes you have a reaction, right? A response. So more often than not, the response is mental. It's a thought or a chain of thoughts, right? Such as, well, I see there's a problem here, right? And a problem, like I previously mentioned, is an interference or a rupture, right? A change in the status quo, in what's been, right? It's no longer what has been. Now it changes, right? And since it changes, you need to adapt, you need to react to that, right? You need to fix the problem ultimately. So as I was thinking, um, I felt like the first thing that pops into your head is usually the right answer. Right now, people talk about brainstorming, and I agree with brainstorming. It's good to brainstorm, it's good to have multiple alternatives. Um, but what it's going to come down to ultimately when you're problem solving is the how, right? Because you can say, okay, look, we have a problem. Here's solution one, right? Which is the first impulsive, obvious, evident solution that you come up with. This is the solution, right? And people will say, well, wait a minute. Let's think things through. Let's come up with better ideas. Let's see if there are better ideas. Let's look at alternatives. Let's look at options. Let's check our resources, right? Let's think things through. Okay, so let's generate alternative 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., right? Okay, fine. Alternative 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6 sounds better, right? They're better ideas. They're more ideal. We can even say they're more romantic. Okay, now let's go back, right? Let's say these are our possible solutions. We have 6 possible solutions on the table. When we talk about solutions, what we're ultimately talking about is our objectives, right? Which are the end goals of things, and the how is basically working backwards now and figuring out the steps to get there, right? So if we tell ourselves then, okay, how are we going to resolve or solve these problems? Well, with these solutions, right? This is the solution. We can think of it like maybe, I don't know, something like, I need food to eat. What's the solution? Get money. Okay, so that's the solution. That's the problem. How are we going to get money? That is, how are we going to achieve our goals, right? And that's where we can really get creative. Now, we inevitably get creative because that's when we really think things through, right? Because until then, we're only figuring out different goals, different objectives, different solutions, right? Which is fine. But once you really start to break down the process of a solution, excuse me, that is the road to the objective, that's when you really get real, right? And that's when you really have to figure out how things work, right? That's reality. So you say, and that's what I mean by the first solution is usually the most, it's usually the best solution because it's the most efficient. It requires the least amount of time, resources, investment. Um, it will get you to where you need to go, right? And you may say it's not ideal because there are better solutions, of course, but because they're better solutions, they're going to require better resources, more time, more investment, right? More considerations, more problems, more mini problems, more obstacles, right? So looking at it from of course, it also depends on the type of problem you have. It may require more sophisticated, elegant processes and solutions, right? Which is fine. But if you think about like a typical everyday common problem that you have, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's at work, whether it's with your family, with your friends, whatever, with yourself, it's usually the first obvious solution that you think of. And then the problem then is not really generating different types of solutions. The problem becomes then the process, right? The how. How am I going to achieve the steps required to get to that solution, right? How am I going to make sure that the solution stays in place, right? And without my doing in it, right? Because at first you're going to be doing the stuff, or someone's going to be doing whatever actions need to be done in order to get to the solution. But are you going to have to keep on doing them, right? Which is a behavioral problem. If I am no longer then to make sure things get done, will things still get done, right? Which was the example of punishment, negative punishment in behaviorism, where no, positive punishment, I think, where the typical example of a speeding car sees a police officer, right? Slows down, passes the police officer or the cop car, and as soon as the cop car is out of sight, begins to speed again, right? So the behavior deterrent in that situation is the police officer, right? But again, as soon as the police officer is no longer around, well, the guy's breaking the law again and speeding. So that's what I mean about making sure things will still get done even though you're not there, because otherwise you have a permanent problem that needs a permanent solution, and it needs you there permanently, and it's taking up permanently your resources, your time, right? So that's kind of where AI also comes in, and technology, because technology is, you're able to outsource a lot of your work to technology, right? Like now with AI, for example, there are applications where you can make presentations for a class or for different things, right? For a conference. So a lot of the work gets done for you, a lot of the design work. I mean, the content stuff and knowing your craft, you still need to know that. You still need to be able to deliver that on stage or in a class when you're there. But for example, if you're like, I'm not really into designing a presentation, I don't really care about the color, I don't really care about the text font, the text style, whatever, well, AI will do that, right? And then you have more time to focus on the things that really matter, like knowing information, having examples, etc. So I was thinking about problem solving and also how you can apply that stuff, right? Like recently, I came across an interesting topic in psychology, which is the functional analysis approach or therapeutical approach, which is basically when you analyze behavior. And I think it works really well for, see, behaviorism works well for things that are like short lived, right? It even says it's used to like break habits, to change perspectives on phobias, or to help students improve their performance in school and education, to help athletes perform better, things like that. So it's obviously behaviorism. It's not a therapy that is used for like pathologies or extreme cases or severe disorders, right? Mental disorders. It's just something that you can use for like situate, like I would even say, well, not common day situations, but I think psychologists will apply behavior tools when a case is not that extreme, right? So the ABC thing works kind of with the cause and effect element, which is fundamental in behaviorism, which is to analyze what happens before a behavior, to analyze the behavior, and then to analyze what happens after the behavior. And the really interesting part is to analyze what happens after a behavior, because when you analyze what happens after a behavior, then you're basically answering the question of what that behavior was really doing instead of just a superficial answer. Which, like, an example for this is a kid cries in a store, right? And the parents leave the store because the kid didn't get their toy or whatever. So then, superficially, you may say, well, the kid was crying because the kid wanted a toy, right? But if you analyze it more deeply or deeper, you may say, no, what the kid really wanted was to leave the store because he was tired or she was tired or whatever, right? And that's like going a step further. It's kind of like how reinforcement also works. You have a stimuli, right? Or a stimulus that comes in, you have a response, and then you have a reinforcement, which is the consequence of the consequence. It's the consequence of the effect, right? Which is basically like some form of evaluation, like this was either good, it benefited me, so I will repeat that behavior, or this was bad, the consequence of the consequence was bad, so I will stop doing that, right? So that's a little bit of behaviorism in a nutshell. And yeah, I mean, like, for I think psychology is good for also, like, people that want to talk about things, that want to talk things through, because a lot of times you may have a situation, you may have a repeated situation, repeated drama, not trauma, drama, repeated social problems, right? And it's interesting to see, and I think therapy nowadays is more focused on context, which is, I think, good. It's right. It's correct, because I mean, you can't really separate the person. I mean, unless it's like a neurological condition or something like that, or a physiological, biological, genetic condition. Uh, People, common day people, we can just say, are people that are basically going through their life in different social contexts, right? And the social contexts in which they're in ultimately influence them, just like they influence the social context, right? And this interaction with the social context is going to generate friction, problems, due to the fact that people will react in different ways, will act differently, right? And then, I guess, the 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 problems that are generated have to be looked at to a certain extent, by asking the questions, why did this happen, um, but also, how am I going to solve this, right? How am I going to, and that's where the problem solving element really comes into place, right? um, of course, the problem solving element, or the problem solving idea, is plagued with obstacles, right? Because you may say, well, okay, I know I have to do this, but I don't want to, because I hate that person, or I'm resentful, or because of all these other things, right? So then we get into deeper stuff, and it's not really just one, like, straight line to the solution of that problem. Now we have to consider, like, different elements, right? So I feel like you can show the way to a certain extent, but also you have to, at times, which I think is what the psychoanalysts do, like, just simply listen to the person. No, like, this idea of having someone think things through, right? And I also feel like, like the last video that I made, I felt like I was talking things through, like, in the video, because I think it's very differently, like, when you write. See, when I write, I'm limited by how fast my fingers can type, right? Like, my mind is going faster than my fingers. And when I'm thinking, I don't really have the pressure to keep going, right? Like if I'm thinking about something and then I just stop, or I get lazy or I get distracted. But if I'm like making a video, I feel I'm pressured to keep talking, because otherwise, well, if there's silence, it's like, what, why am I, the person can say, well, why am I even watching this, or why am I even doing this, right? In my case. So I feel like it's kind of therapeutic also, to a certain extent, because you also feel like you're figuring out your problems, or you're thinking things through ultimately. And to a certain extent, I also feel like that's what people that listen to other people do for other people, right? So if you're listening to someone just telling you all of their things, right, discharging emotionally, then you're helping them, right, inevitably. So that's like when people will say, like, I need to talk to you, I need a friend to talk to, and you hear them. And I was watching this therapist. It was a live mock session. It was very interesting because, and I'm still trying to figure out if the question she was making was the same as the why, why, right? And just going back and deeper into like the I'm gonna use the word she used. The word she used is the core belief. So what she was trying to do is she was trying to get the mock patient, which really turned out to be more of like a real. It was a simulated therapy session, but it turned out to be like a real therapy session. Um, because I mean, you can't see, even if you act. There's only so much you can make up before you actually start to use things from your real life. And plus, it was a core belief that I think is very common in our everyday life. So the core belief was, I'm worthless, right? And in order to get to I'm worthless, or I don't deserve to be loved, the therapist kept asking this question. Like, I think the initial idea of the person was, I can't find a love partner, right? Or I just recently broke up and I feel like I will never find a person to be with, right? And then the therapist asked something along the lines of, what does that mean? Right? Or what does that imply? And I'm trying to figure out whether what does that mean or what does that imply means why. I don't think it does. I don't think it's the same thing, because what does that imply or what does that mean actually means to look at the context behind that, right? So if I tell you, for instance, let's use something personal. I feel like I'm not a good enough teacher, right? What does that mean? Well, that means that students will see me as a fraud, or students will see me as someone that doesn't know their stuff, right? And what does that mean? Well, that means that like, beyond humiliation, I could lose my job or something like that, right? And what does that mean? Well, see, we keep going back. So, what if I were to ask why? What if I were to say, well, I feel like I'm not a good enough teacher. Why? Well, because sometimes when I'm like, in class, I'll stutter, I'll get nervous, I'll forget things, right? So I think it is different. Why? Well, because I don't have experience yet, right? Why? Well, because I need like more time to gain experience and things like that. So they go through different answers. So I'm guessing they're different. I don't know how they're different, but what does that mean? Obviously takes into consideration the context, I can say initially, and just asking why basically gives you like, lets you know what you need, right? So in this case, I just need more time, right? And but what does that mean? Leads you to like your core belief, your core fear, we can even say, right? Which in this case would be like not having a job. And then what does that mean? Well, that would mean that I would have to go out, look for work, right? And if I can't find it, then I would be like stressed out, or irritated or whatever, right? um so yeah, I think they have different functions, right? I even think the whys, see, if you work both lines of questioning, you may get to like what you need ultimately as well, right? Or not what you need, but the core belief of what does that mean can lead you to maybe like saying, well, it won't be that bad, or maybe that's not reality, right? I'm over exaggerating, which is ultimately what I think what people try to do when they try to like break down a core belief, right? What you're trying to do is tell the person like, see, what you think, like your core belief isn't really that strong, or that's not even really like real, right? You're exaggerating ultimately, but the person needs to see that. So I think those are powerful ways. A final idea on this was a video that I was watching with Jordan Peterson, and I think he was talking about, very interestingly, how anxiety is like objective conflict or goal conflict, right? Which I guess is when you have many different goals. Excuse me. And there's even an example for this. They say, well, what happens when I think I was thinking of an example based off another example that I saw where where there's a student in class, the student hasn't finished, let's say Paul hasn't finished his homework. So he starts to get stressed out. He only has like 10 minutes to finish his homework before the teacher comes for class. And the teacher is going to ask for his homework. All of a sudden, like the girl that he likes just asked him if she wants to go with her to the cafeteria to get some food. At the same time, his friend over here is asking him to help him on something else, and then he gets a text message from his mom saying, "Call me, it's urgent." Right? So you have, in that case, ultimately what's going to motivate him to prioritize between the different things or the different stimuli that is present is uh, his motivation to tend to one thing or the other, right? So, but that doesn't mean that anxiety won't be felt, right? So the anxiety is I guess according to Peterson, something like figuring out which decision to make, right? Which could lead to paralysis. And in this case, the person would just, maybe just like freeze up and not know what to do, which is a possibility, right? So I also found that to be kind of interesting. But yeah, that idea of working backwards, working forward, figuring out what, the ABC component that I was talking about. Component. I was like, so with the pronunciation. So anyway, I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. I thought I'd think things through based on problem solving and different types of, and there's a lot of things that you can do. I guess what works best for you is what's currently, what you're currently seeing, what's currently there, right? What you currently have to work with. And of course, what you remember from years ago that you studied or whatever comes to your unconscious, I think it's that you need to trust your unconscious. What comes into your mind, if you've done the work, like I mentioned in the previous video, if you've studied, if you've committed, if you're responsible, if you've been reading, if you've been doing the work, in the moment, whatever you need will manifest itself to you because it's there, right? So I feel like you also need to trust your unconscious flow, stop being nervous, even though it's easier said than done, but just focus on what you, and I kind of feel like I'm telling myself this, right? Which is what I mentioned about the therapeutic kind of like feeling with the last video and with this video. But yeah, trust your unconscious. Your unconscious is always there for you. It's your shadow, your number one buddy. It's always got your back. Trust your unconscious. Flow. Say what you need to say in the moment. And I feel like that's the right thing, right? Again, there's a power in the first obvious thing, right? Which is the difference between the two processes of thinking, right? The fast and the slow thinking. I've always opted more for the fast because I feel like the deliberate, slow process of thinking is fine. It's good. It has its place in certain things, but the fast thinking process also has its value, right? And it's not all about being slow. See, like I've been seeing these stupid videos that they say like pause before you speak, right? Or make a pause before answering a question, because that way you're going to show power. And I'm like, that's ridiculous, right? Like to me, it's just like, what the hell are you doing? Just answer the question, right? Because I've always been fast. I've always been, like anxious, nervous, whatever. So I feel like that's a superpower too. You feed yourself, obviously, information, things, knowledge. You think things through deliberately, slowly, like right now. But then when you're, as we can say, when you're not backstage anymore, when you're center stage, when you're on stage, you only have to respond. You can't stutter, you can't stumble, you can't think things through, you can't because there's an audience, there are people waiting, right, for you to perform, for you to say things, to act. So I feel like that's when your unconscious should manifest itself. And as a final thought, I was watching the Malcolm X video, Michael Malcolm X movie with Denzel Washington, and I was thinking like, how do you become an influential speaker? How do you become someone that people want to hear, right? Because the soapboxes, like you had these people in the beginning of the movie like sitting, they weren't really soapboxes, they even had like a kind of ladder, but in on the street they would just climb this little ladder and they would start speaking about justice and equality and all these things, and people would just kind of gather around them. And I felt like, if I did that on the street right now, would people gather around me, or would they just think I'm like some crazy person? I think there are places to do that. Like if you went downtown, and there are people there, and maybe there are people hanging out, they might, stop and listen to you and things like that. But yeah, man, like the idea of a powerful, influential, charismatic speaker, I think is very attractive. You need to figure out how to say things in a way that people want to hear them, simplify them, but at the same time have them be powerful. It's like a whole paradox there. But yeah, I feel like you also practice, feel things out. And again, I do feel that you can train yourself to do certain things. So I feel like what I'm kind of doing here. But anyway, yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Peace.